Today we're going to do a quick review of factoring by filling out this graphic organizer. So the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and zoom in so it's easier for y'all to see and easier for me to write. Alright, so the first step in factoring. The first step in factoring is you always want to factor out your GCF. Alright, so we want to always check to make sure that all of our terms don't have anything in common that we could factor out. After we factor out our GCF, it's going to depend on how many terms we have. So notice we have three cases. We could have 2 terms, 3 terms, or 4 terms. The first one that we're going to start off with is our 2 terms case. And we're going to have 2 different types of problems. The first one is the easier one, the difference of squares. So if we take a look at the difference of squares, the first thing you have to make sure is it's a subtraction problem. If it's not subtraction, you can't factor it. The other thing is we want to make sure both terms are perfect squares. In this case, both terms are perfect squares. So from there, all you're going to do is take the square root of both terms. So I get x, y, one has a plus, one has a minus, and we're done. And we have our final answer. So let's take a look at our example. So if we take a look at our example, notice 9 and 16 are both perfect squares. So if I take the square root of both of those, I'm going to get 3x plus 4y, and then you have to have another one that's exactly the same except it's subtraction. And then we're done. That's our final answer. Now the harder case is the sum or difference of cubes. We still only have 2 terms, but in this case it does not matter whether you have addition or subtraction. It works for both. You have to check to make sure both terms are perfect cubes. I'm going to have 5 steps that we're going to take in order to factor the sum or difference of cubes. The first one is going to be take the cube. So you start off the cube root of x cubed, I get x. I take the cube root of y cubed, I get y. After you take the cube, you're going to square the first. If I square the first term, I get x squared. After you square the first, you're going to change the sign. So notice, if it was a plus, it becomes a minus. If it was a minus, it becomes a plus. After you change the sign, you're going to multiply together. If you multiply together, you just take x times y and you get xy. And then the last one is going to be to square the last. If I square the last term, I'm going to get y squared. So let's go ahead and look at an example. So notice I have 2 terms. I have addition and it doesn't matter, but 27 and 8 are both perfect squares. So the first step, I'm going to take the cube root. So if I take the cube root of 27, I get 3. The cube root of x cubed is x, plus cube root of 8 is going to be 2. Then I'm going to start my new parentheses. After you take the cube, you're going to square the first. If I square 3x, I'm going to get 9x squared. After you square the first, you change the sign, so it was a plus, so now it becomes a minus. You multiply together, so 3x times 2 gives us 6x. And then finally, the last thing we're going to do is we're going to square the last term. 2 squared gives me a plus 4. And that is my final answer. Alright, so now we're done with the 2 cases if we have 2 terms. Now let's take a look. What if we have 3 terms? Alright, if we have 3 terms, you're going to look in one spot, whether or not you have a coefficient in front of your x squared. So the first one we're going to look at is what if we do not have a coefficient in front of the x squared. Basically what we want to do is we want to find 2 numbers that multiply to c and add to your middle term. That's all you're going to do. Once you find those two numbers, then you're going to rewrite your answer in this form. So let's take a look at our example. So in this case, I need two numbers that multiply to 12 and add to 7. So two numbers that multiply to 12 and add to 7 are going to be positive 3 and positive 4. So my final answer is going to be x plus 3 and x plus 4. Alright, now let's take a look at a trinomial that has a coefficient in front of our x squared term. If it has a coefficient in front of our x squared term, that means we're going to have to use the bridge method. And we discussed this a little bit last semester. So let's take a look at an example. The first thing we're going to do is you're going to take 6 times negative 5. So you multiply those two numbers, and I'm going to get negative 30. So you two numbers need to multiply to negative 30. Then you also need two numbers that are going to add, let me erase that, that are going to add to 7. So two numbers that multiply to negative 30 and add to 7 are going to be positive 10x and a negative 3. So once you find your two numbers, you're going to split them up. Split that middle term up using those two numbers. And then all you're going to do is you're going to bring down the 6x squared, and then you're going to bring down the minus 5. Now, I probably should have talked about factor by grouping first, but that now notice how many terms we have. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, so we're going to factor by grouping. So I'm going to group the first two terms together and then the last two terms together. So the first two terms both have a 2x. So if I factor out a 2x, I'm going to get 3x plus 5. Now the last two terms don't have anything in common, but they both are negative, so I'm going to factor out a negative 1. And I'm going to get 3x plus 5. So then my final answer is going to be 2x minus 1 and a 3x plus 5. And that's it. So again, if we have three terms, you have to determine, does my first term have a coefficient? If it does, if you have a x squared, you're going to use the bridge method. If you don't, you can use the shortcut method. But I will tell you, the bridge method will always work. Alright, the last one, and we just kind of talked about it, and it's probably one of the easier methods, is factor by grouping. And we know that we're going to factor by grouping if we have 4 or more terms. So first, if we have 4 or more terms, you're going to factor by grouping. So you're going to group first two terms and last two terms together. So that's how we're going to factor by grouping. So let's just take a look at an example, even though we kind of just did one. So if I group the first two together and then group the last two together, the first two have an x squared, and if I factor out an x squared, I'm going to be left with x minus 2. The last two have both a negative 3. Oop, I made a mistake. Let's go ahead and just change that to a plus so it works out. So if I factor out a negative 3, you're going to get x minus 2. So then our final answer is going to be x squared minus 3 times x minus 2 as our final answer. So hopefully you found this helpful. The best thing, you should go through this thought process each time. Again, the first thing you want to do is you want to factor the GCF out. After you factor the GCF out, you're going to look, how many terms do I have? And that's going to tell you how you factor the equation or the expression.